North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea. Welcome to the Impossible State. I am so happy to be back in the seat with you, Victor, here. I've taken a little break, had a lot going on in external relations, but I'm glad to be back. And I'm super glad that we have our former colleague, the amazing Bonnie Glaser, here. Bonnie is the managing director of GMF Indo-Pacific, and she is a longtime colleague. Bonnie, so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
We miss having you at CSIS. Heather stole you, and it's just not cool. So I just want to get that out there at the beginning, right? Okay.
I left before Heather, but anyway.
All right. We have to give Heather a little bit of the business, but anyway, today we want to talk about this downward spiral in China-Korea relations, and we want to talk about whether it can be stopped or not. So, Victor, I want to go to you first. How bad has this gotten between between South Korea and China?
Yeah, well, first, it's good to have you back, Andrew, and it's great to have Bonnie here. I mean, we were talking earlier, Bonnie's timing is amazing. Like, she goes to GMF just as the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic theaters are sort of coming together. So she had, like, the perfect timing in terms of that. I don't know, the view from China might be different, but when I look at it from the South Korean perspective, this is a relationship that in the past was always framed as being in the most positive light. Despite blemishes and other sorts of things, in general, there was a consensus to frame it in the most positive light. And now the relationship, I think, has changed quite a bit to the point where the two are now publicly demarching each other. And taking offense at statements that the other has made. And it's had real impact on the ground in terms of public opinion polls in South Korea, as well as in terms of commercial business. So it's something that may have been brewing for some time under the new government, not so new anymore, over a year government in South Korea, but it's really kind of bubbled up to the surface so that everybody can see it now.
All right, so Bonnie, what are the Chinese upset about? In particular, is this about Taiwan?
Well, part of it is about Taiwan, and we have had a shift in posture, I think, under President Yoon, where he has said very explicitly force should not be used to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. He also made a statement a few weeks ago that compared China and Taiwan to North Korea, saying it's a global issue. The Taiwan Strait is a global issue like North Korea. And of course, North Korea is a member of the UN. Taiwan is not. All sorts of differences between the two. I think that really irked the Chinese. But there have also been the joint statement between President Yoon and President Biden when President Yoon visited that mentioned Taiwan as well. And President Moon had mentioned this once in a statement in 2021 that was signed. It was one sentence, but you can see that this has really expanded. And Chinese concerns about Taiwan are growing now because of the elections that are coming up next year in Taiwan. But there are other issues other than Taiwan. And I would say that the cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea is really significant in this regard. And just recently, there was an agreement to strengthen cooperation on ballistic missile defense data sharing. And so you might remember under President Moon, there was the 3 no's. And so the Chinese essentially thought they had pocketed this gain, that there would be no further deployments of THAAD missile defense systems and no missile defense cooperation that would be among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. So I think they're very upset about that, too.
All right. So, Victor, what are the Koreans so upset about?
Well, I mean, it's good. It's very interesting to hear from Bonnie the China perspective because, this is a pretty significant split now in the relationship. The South Koreans are still upset with Chinese economic coercion. There was a massive amount of it in 2016, 2017 when the missile defense battery was first put into Korea. The Defense Ministry and Environment Ministry just announced that the environmental study with regard to the electromagnetic field from the X-band radar has no deleterious effects on the health of the communities in the area. This has been the primary reason that the missile defense system has not operated at full capacity. Now that assessment is done, so it's most likely that that will move to full capacity operation, which probably won't make the Chinese very happy at all. When you talk to people in Korea on the ground, they say that they don't say publicly, and the government I don't think has referenced it, but that China still continues to course economically. It already did what it did to Lotte, the Lotte group, kicking them basically out of China, and they targeted the Lotte group because the Lotte group owned the golf course in Korea where the U.S. put the THAAD system, right? But they've done other things too, and in particular, group tourism from China to South Korea has completely dried up, right? And that's not because Chinese don't want to come to Korea; they come as individuals. But group tourism has dried up, and it's dried up to the point where Korean Airlines and Asiana are now canceling their routes, their summer routes between South Korea and major Chinese cities: Beijing, Xi'an. Xiamen, Shenzhen, a number of them.
This has got to be a big economic hit for the South
Sure,
Koreans.
yeah. I mean, air travel between those cities is down something like 40% or more right now. So they're clearly upset. They're clearly upset that they're upset that that the Chinese government has made statements about President Yoon, right? That have been not very diplomatic, we should say. And they're also not happy with some of the threats, veiled threats, maybe not so veiled, that came from, I don't know if it was the Director General, the Foreign Ministry, but someone who came to Korea and reportedly said that there will be no high-level summit meetings, including high-level meetings, including summit meetings, until Korea changes its statements on Taiwan. So these sorts of things, I think, have gotten the Koreans quite upset, and again, against what is, this backdrop of, in general, the Koreans have always been willing to cut a lot of slack for China, but the situation really has changed.
So, Bonnie, back to you. I want to ask you. South Korea recently completed their environmental study for THAAD, and it looks like full steam ahead. How do you think Xi is going to react?
Well, the Chinese have stopped talking for a while about the THAAD system, but now that it is going forward and there could be even more missile defense batteries, I think we're going to hear a doubling down again on their opposition to THAAD. And we should recall that initially China's reaction was really framed as saying that the THAAD missile defense system would undercut their nuclear deterrent. And I know that experts both in Korea and the United States rejected that. We did have conversations with the Chinese. Our militaries were actually talking at that time. They're really not now. Yeah. And but we tried to dispel this concern, which the U.S. believed was not true. And I think that the Chinese now are going to start talking about that again, how it damages Chinese interests, it will undercut their nuclear deterrent. They will try to find all sorts of reasons why Korea should not go forward with these deployments. But I'm sure that they will. We could see a resumption of even more of the economic coercion. Some of it has gone away, as I understand. I mean, we still have probably fewer of the Korean products that are being bought. I don't know how much the cosmetic industry has come back. Some of it, of course, is due to COVID. It's difficult, I think, to unpack how much of this is still a holdover from COVID. So, for example, the Chinese had blocked these Korean cultural groups from performing, like rock bands. There probably aren't too many foreign rock bands that are performing anyway in China. Right. So as the COVID restrictions get pulled back and more foreigners start coming, maybe that will be put to a test. But I think that the Chinese are going to look for ways to put pressure on Korea, but try to avoid having Korea end up completely in the U.S. camp. So this is a concern. The pressure they estimated when President Moon was in power, they knew that there would be some sort of rollback or greater caution on the part of the Korean government. But now I think they have the opposite concern, that maybe this could really push President Yoon even more into the lap, as they would say, of the United States. And they are trying to drive wedges between the United States and its allies. And there's no doubt they've always seen Korea as the weakest link. Right. And one thing that they've always tried to use is that the fact that China has a better relationship with North Korea than any other country in the world. I think the Chinese have always told the South Koreans, well, whatever happens, China's always going to play a role, even though they say, don't overestimate our influence. I think that quietly they also say, don't underestimate our influence. So I think they try to use that with the Koreans. And the Koreans have always felt if there's going to be any hope for reunification, right, it's going to have to be with China's help. So they're going to try to use that too. So I don't think we'll go back to the kind of Lotte economic coercion, but we could see maybe a more sophisticated Chinese approach this time.
Let me just add, I think on the North Korea card issue, I think one of the things, I agree with Bonnie completely that the Chinese will probably try to play this card at some point, but what's interesting now in South Korea under this new government and in general is that the South Koreans really have lost confidence that China can play a constructive role on the Korean Peninsula in ways that benefit South Korean interests and policy objectives. I think they've kind of lost confidence in everybody, including the United States, in terms of being able to denuclearize North Korea. So. And I think there are some in South Korea who are upset at how China has basically backstopped North Korea during the COVID lockdown. In fact, essentially been the only country that has been providing any sort of support. But again, on the ground, 80% of the South Korean public now see China as the most disliked country. And then when you look at people in their 20s and 30s, that demographic, people who, 7 years ago, right, were in high school or in college, right when the THAAD sanctions were happening, and were very much influenced by that. The number is 90%, right? 90% in their 20s and 30s see China as the most disliked country, and this is a country. Usually Japan is up there, right? But it's now China. So that's a big shift.
Well. Bonnie mentioned that China thinks Korea is the weak link. Victor, do you think Yoon is going to buckle under this Chinese pressure, or is he going to stand strong?
So I think Yoon's policy on this really has been quite interesting to watch. When he was first elected and in the transition, their transition team came over. It was led by Park Jin, who would become foreign minister. They came over and we talked to them. And they were very clear, the United States is super important. The relationship with Japan is something that they want to turn around. They want to help on economic security, Quad, so on and so forth. But on China, they said mutual respect, right? A relationship based on mutual respect. Important economic partner. We want to have good relations. So it was a very simple 3-bullet talking point, with none of the enthusiasm or conviction that they talked about these other issues. And so, as Bonnie said, we saw that Yoon, after that, started taking these very small steps that clearly looked like they were moving away from, a traditional hedging position on China. They joined the Mineral Security Partnership. They want to be part of the Quad. They reinvigorated Korea, Japan, and trilateral relations. And then at the state visit, this statement on Taiwan, right, that came out in the state visit. And then they were part of the G7, right, which had the big statements on China as well. So he's clearly taken these steps. Now, I think initially China was worried, but they didn't say anything publicly. I don't know if you got the sense, but I got the sense that they kept reaching out to South Korea for track 2s, track 1.5s, because they were worried about what was happening. But after the state visit, after President Yoon came here and sung American Pie, right, after he did that,
talk about K-pop.
K-pop. It all came out into the open and became much more public now. So, so it's interesting. So I don't think he'll buckle. I think he's has a pretty strong conviction on this, and it may not be popular. He may not be popular overall, but as I said, public opinion on China right now is pretty low in South Korea. So I don't think he'll hear a lot of complaints. He may hear it from the political opposition because it's politics, but I think in general, the public may have not supported his Japan policy, but I think they support his China policy.
Interesting. I want to shift for a minute to the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. Bonnie, how's China going to react to this meeting, and how did they react to the G7 leaders' statement about China's economic coercion?
Well, the Chinese definitely objected to the G7 statement about economic coercion and said essentially this is aimed at containing Chinese development. If there's one thing the Chinese strongly object to, it is the coalition building that they see as very much anti-China. It's the Quad, it's AUKUS, but it's also G7. It's what some people call the AP4, the Asia-Pacific Four, and those are the leaders of Australia, Korea, Japan, and New Zealand who will be attending this upcoming NATO summit, and they attended the NATO summit last year in Madrid. And in fact, I held a conference that I did cooperatively with the Lithuanian government just a few months ago, which was a sort of precursor to talk with the NATO countries and representatives from these four countries from the Asia Pacific. And it was really interesting to see like where they converge and where they don't. We did two panels that were public, and there was a vice foreign minister from Korea who participated. He was very nervous. He told me afterwards I'd asked too sensitive questions, but he was really terrific, and he had this really thick briefing book, so his staff had him really well prepared. But it's clear that this is a priority, I think, for the countries in the Indo-Pacific as well as for NATO to start connecting and figure out where they share interests and how they can work together. There is nothing that China is going to be more fearful of. The Chinese have always worried about the expansion of NATO to the shores of the Asia-Pacific. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made that position very public. The Chinese have blamed NATO for the invasion to begin with. I mean, all the problems of Ukraine are because of NATO. And so I think ultimately they're more sensitive now than they were before. And they see, there's an oak tree, which they then see an entire forest. They think there's this potential that NATO will be setting up shops, sending troops, maybe, ships, et cetera, contingency planning to intervene in Taiwan. You can only imagine how concerned the Chinese are going to be. And right now there's this discussion about a NATO office in Japan, and it's been reported that France is not terribly enthusiastic, and the Chinese are probably very appreciative if the French don't support this. So they're again trying to drive wedges and limit the impact to their interests. But I do think that they are concerned, and they're concerned about, as I said, sort of all of this coalition building that they see as far more effective under the Biden administration. If there was one thing that President Trump did not engage in, it was trying to strengthen alliances to deal with China.
Yeah, and let me go back to something that Bonnie said about China's views on sort of the region and Korea being sort of the lowest hanging fruit to try to lop off from the alliance coalition. Before the Yoon government came into power, China, just like you said, they thought it was a freebie. Like the differences between Korea and Japan, that was just like a freebie to them. They didn't have to do much, and they could sort of keep that U.S., Korea, Japan triangle pretty dysfunctional, right? Our two major allies keep it pretty dysfunctional without much hard work, right? But then this government comes in. Yoon, despite this was sort of the hardest thing he could have done domestically, right, was to take on the Japan issue as his first foreign policy. Domestically, very difficult to do. And then he initially there was very little Japanese response, but it got better, and now they've had 2 summit meetings already. They were at Hiroshima, obviously together for the G7. They will be together in Vilnius next month. And so this is something I think that worries China. when the Koreans announced the labor compensation deal, the so-called deal, Biden and Blinken immediately supported it. They got on social media and supported it. But you heard nothing from China, right? They said nothing about it, obviously, and the North Koreans criticized it. And then I think eventually the Chinese said something, but that was not positive on it. So this coalition building, as Bonnie said, is something that is perplexing and worrying to the Chinese, and to be able to for the U.S., Korea, and Japan to work together as well as they are on all of these different issues, I think was not something that China expected would be easy to achieve, and yet it's happening now.
So Korea is invited to Vilnius.
Yeah, they're invited to Vilnius. They were invited to Madrid. I think they really like these meetings. I think they have this bumper sticker of GPS, Global Pivotal State, which is an effort to expand Korea's foreign policy horizons way beyond the Korean Peninsula, in part because I think Yoon really does. He knows nothing. He knew nothing about foreign policy, but he figured out he wants to support democracy and freedom. And so he's been very outspoken on Ukraine, right? He's been very outspoken, and he's taken actions on Ukraine that arguably go beyond what Japan has even done on Ukraine. And there may be more to come, right? There may be more to come. So I think he very much likes being part of this AP4. When I talk to administration officials, my sense is there are no plans not to continue this, that they want to continue this. With NATO support, of course, that they'd like to continue this. And so I expect that he'll be quite prominent at this thing. And again, as Bonnie said, I think a lot of action is taking place in things like the G7 and in the NATO plus AP4, because not a lot can take place in the UN Security Council anymore, right? With China and Russia opposition. So I feel like a lot of these institutions, at least from a Western perspective on global governance, are now shifting to these other groupings, G7 plus Australia, South Korea, and whoever else was there, and then NATO and the AP4.
Well, it's interesting. I want to turn a bit to how China has helped North Korea through the COVID lockdown, which really North Korea lasted longer than anyone else. Yeah. We've talked about that on this podcast before. But Bonnie, how much has China helped North Korea?
Well, I'd start by saying that North Korea didn't accept vaccines from any country, including China, and I assume that the Chinese offered their vaccines, but as far as I know, they did not accept them. We did see in May of 2022, that was when the Omicron variant really hit North Korea hard. They reported publicly there were over 100,000 cases a day that were testing positive. I don't know if those were new cases each day. They were probably just positive cases. But it was very high enough that there was a South Korean media report that Kim Jong-un had reached out to the Chinese to ask for assistance. And at that time, there were 3 North Korean cargo planes that flew into Shenyang and filled up with medical supplies that they took back to North Korea. So that is at least one data point we know of the Chinese providing assistance. Whether there was more than that, we don't know. But most of the diplomats, and including the Chinese diplomats, left during COVID. It was only March of this year that the new Chinese ambassador, who'd been in place in China as the new ambassador to North Korea since, I think it was 2 years earlier in the spring of 2021, he finally showed up in March in Pyongyang with 9 other diplomats in tow to sort of reestablish the office in Pyongyang. So that tells you that the Chinese didn't really have close communications with the North Koreans during COVID either.
That's one heck of a posting. I mean, it's not exactly Paris, France there.
No, I don't know if they give them hardship pay.
Although, when I was in government, I did meet the Chinese ambassador when he was there, and this is North Korea, right? He's clearly the life of the party. He's the big man on campus.
Yeah, for sure.
If you will, but that's interesting. The 3 airplane shipments of stuff. I mean, clearly it's 3 airplanes, so it's for the elite, right? It's not like
Right.
it's for the general public. And we really still do not have a good sense of how they managed during the COVID lockdown. I mean, China has provided some support, but they were even locked down vis-a-vis China for at least 2 years of the pandemic. They were even sort of cracking down on smuggling networks because they were deathly afraid of the virus coming in. But as you said, in March, the Chinese went back. They were the only ones, I think, who were allowed back in. I know the Europeans and others, the EU countries, all asked to go back in, and they were held back. But
There are still reports of foreign diplomats leaving North
Yeah.
Korea, so I really don't think the trend is yet reversed,
Yeah.
even though there are some countries that would like to get back
yeah,
in.
yeah. I know the UK has asked to go back in. There are a number that are pre-positioning in Seoul, looking for the chance to go back in, but there's been no positive response from North Korea.
Well, Victor, let me ask you this. Does Yoon have any confidence in China on North Korea anymore?
I really don't think so. I think that they certainly understand that what the previous government was trying to do. The previous government was trying to use the relationship with China. Obviously there's an economic relation with China, and that's important, but to try to endear the Chinese to an engagement strategy that would eventually lead to inter-Korean peace and reconciliation. Not necessarily denuclearization, but inter-Korean peace and reconciliation. And for that reason, there was really a classic hedge strategy that was played by the previous government when it came to the United States and China. I don't think Yoon is in that space at all right now. I think he's not particularly interested in engaging with North Korea for the purpose of inter-Korean peace and reconciliation. It's not that he's against peace, but he just doesn't think the North Koreans are interested. And because of that, because if that is the presumption of the policy or the assumption of the policy, then the value of China for the purpose of inter-Korean reconciliation goes way down. And at the same time, he's very much focused on the threat to the liberal international order, the war in Europe, what China might do in Taiwan. Maybe not as vocal as Japan or other countries have been on it, but I think there's really been a change in thinking. I'm sure probably at GMF, but also at CSIS, there's a lot of interest that we're seeing to do more trilaterals, not U.S. Japan Korea, but U.S. Korea Taiwan, right? So there's a lot more interest, I think, in the region and in the world with regard to what's going to happen in the Taiwan Straits as a result of the war in Europe and and China. So.
Well, this brings me to the question, Bonnie. Does all of this U.S. Joint ROK and bilateral military exercising in China's neighborhood have any real impact on Xi and the way he thinks? Does he care about this?
Well, I think that the Chinese have always viewed the United States as trying to take advantage of any of North Korea's provocations to ramp up its own military exercises.
Sure.
So they just think that we use it as an excuse, even though they will not try to pressure North Korea to cut back. But they've always objected to that. And to reiterate the point that I said earlier, I really think that the one thing the Chinese are very concerned about is just its coalitions, and U.S., Japan, South Korea military and ballistic missile defense cooperation, as I said earlier, is really of great concern to them. There was this comment that President Biden said the other day, I think it was in answer to some question a reporter asked him. He said that Xi Jinping had told him that he didn't like what the U.S. was doing with the Quad because it puts him in a bind. The president had never said anything publicly, and I think if you went back and looked at all of the readouts of the meetings between President Biden and Xi Jinping, I don't think you'd find any reference to the Quad. So this doesn't surprise me, though, that Xi Jinping would try to signal that he doesn't like the Quad, and for similar reasons, just doesn't like, I'm sure, U.S., Japan, South Korea cooperation. So Xi Jinping even though he doesn't like it, is not going to moderate his behavior in order to influence it. I don't think that that would be his approach. But he knows that this will be a challenge going forward, just as the Quad, AUKUS, and these other coalitions are going to be for China. But the Chinese talk about struggle. Xi Jinping talks a lot about struggle against the developments in the world that pose for China both risks and opportunities. And it is really noteworthy that when Xi Jinping was in Moscow and he met with Putin as he was leaving Moscow, I don't think that Xi Jinping knew that he was being recorded, but he shook Putin's hand and he said, the changes that are taking place that are unseen in a century, this is one of his statements about the trends in the international situation, on the unseen in a century changes, we are driving them together. And that was so remarkable. Putin said, I agree.
Yeah.
And that shows you that despite the challenges, that he sees that the world is really moving in a positive direction for China. And so I think he has some strategic patience. He can put up with some of the negative consequences that are taking place. We see them in Korea. We see them in the Philippines, where the U.S. is getting greater access to military installations there. We certainly see them with Japan, and we see them with Europe. But I think that Xi Jinping is going to try and drive these changes as much as he can in a positive direction. And he still sees the U.S. is in decline.
Yeah.
It is remarkable. Yeah. Victor, along those lines, do you think, Xi and Yoon have not met in person yet? Do you think it's going to happen? And would it do anything to mend these or slow the decline in relations?
So I don't anticipate any meeting anytime soon, any sort of formal visit, either in Seoul or in Beijing, possibly on the margins of a multilateral meeting, there might be something, but right now, I don't think so. I think the Chinese have pretty much laid out what the conditions are, right, for a meeting, that there's got to be a change in the way that Korea talks about Taiwan. They haven't sort of said so much about, the Korea-Japan or the trilateral military cooperation, though, as Bonnie said, I'm sure it bothers them. But what they've really focused on is the point about internationalizing the Taiwan dispute. That has really sort of been the thing that they focused on. Yoon hasn't really said anything on Hong Kong. He hasn't said really anything that I can recall on Xinjiang, but it's the statements on Taiwan that really have gotten Beijing quite upset. And they've come over and they've demarched the Koreans in Seoul. They've demarched the Korean ambassador in China. Their government mouthpieces have made from pretty clear and derogatory statements about the South Korean president. They've come out and said, they apparently reportedly came out and said, don't bet against China. You're going to regret it. That's pretty straightforward talk.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that whoever allowed,
it's like, don't mess with Texas.
Yeah. And whoever allowed that to be released, clearly did it with a purpose. This was reported in a South Korean newspaper, so they did it with a purpose, right? And so, I really feel like I wrote something a few weeks ago that that sort of said, "Are the gloves off now in the relationship?" And that had a question mark on it, so I would remove the question mark.
The gloves are off.
The gloves are
Exclamation point.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you. Great discussion, Bonnie. Thanks so much for being here with us. Victor, as always. Pleasure being with you. We'll be back next week for another edition of The Impossible State.